right, we are back. I'm just checking quickly to see how many of the, great, looks like the CTAF is filling in nicely. Still have a couple people who haven't come back in at least. Yeah, if you're back, go ahead and turn your camera on, thanks, so I can know you're here. Okay. Which we're still missing. There's Say, Felicia, Annette, Dr. Singh. I think that's pretty much it. We're almost there. Okay. If someone could just shoot a quick email or text to Felicia and to Annette to make sure that they come back, because we need to make sure that everybody is present when everybody who's going to vote is present for the discussion of the voting questions. Otherwise, why don't we go ahead and get started? We have only 40 minutes, actually, because we want to make sure we have lots of time to talk through the policy roundtable. So at this point, what we do, again, just from a kind of those of you watching the webcast, what we're going to do is to, in a sense, revisit some of the information that's been presented and focus it in on some specific votes on comparative clinical effectiveness, potential other benefits and contextual considerations, and then we have a single long-term value for money question. So just to be also clear, the patient population for all these questions is the population of adults with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. So I think we are probably going to go ahead and do a test vote, right? So Monica, do you want to go ahead and, or Laura, I'm not sure who was set up to do the test vote, but why don't you go ahead and take over?
Sure. So good afternoon, CTAF. By now, everybody should be logged on to the voting software, and we're going to begin with the test question. I'll give everyone a few seconds just to make sure you see this on your mobile device or web browser. If you have any difficulty, you can send Laura or Azanta a message. So the test question is, in what year did Columbus Day become a federal holiday? A, 1952, B, 1946, C, 1937, and D, 1971. Please pick from these 4 choices. Once we have 15 votes, I'll go ahead and display the results. Looks like we're still waiting on 4 people to vote.
This is the time to raise your hand if you're having trouble finding the voting software, if anything like that is still an issue.
All right, waiting on 2 more.
I'm seeing Jeff off camera, and I think that's the only person I see who's not on camera, at least. Jeff, are you there? Maybe he voted and stepped away. All right.
Did vote and step away.
Okay, so I'm not sure, did you count, do we need to count again, or should it be 15 votes?
We have 13 right now.
Right, but how many voting members of CTAF do we have?
15 today.
So let's work this through. We want to get this straightened out beforehand. Monica, can you just advise them how to check to see if their vote has been registered?
Yep, you'll know it went through if on your mobile device it says you casted your vote, or on your web browser your choice will be highlighted in blue. So if you're not seeing either of those, you could just either raise your hand or send Laura Zonta a quick message.
Or should we raise our hand if we think we have voted?
We could do that as well, yep.
We were at 14, but I see it's gone back down to 13.
I
How can you
I don't need to be able to vote. I'm clicking, but nothing's moving.
Oh, if you click it a second time, it does unvote. So make sure it says response received, apparently.
No,
So if you're using your mobile device, the screen won't change until Monica closes the vote. So as long as your answer is highlighted in blue on your phone, you should be good.
well, I did that. Let me try again.
Oh, we were at 14 and then it went back down to, okay, we're at 14 right now.
It's not working.
Monica, this is
Yes.
Tony. I'm voting on my desktop computer
Mm-hmm.
on a browser, and as far as I can see, my vote it's gone blue anyhow, the tab I voted, which was B, but that's all it does. It doesn't give me a receipt or anything like that. Or
That's all you need for the web browser.
so as long as you're getting a button that's blue, or okay, thank
Correct.
you.
Correct.
By the way, I don't know the answer to this particular question.
It's gone back down to 13. Now it's up again. Does everyone think they voted?
No. I'm unable to vote. I'll do it on the phone. I'm trying to do it on the computer, but it doesn't take my vote.
Oh, we have 15 now though. So I think it might have gone through.
No, mine wouldn't have.
I think in the interest of time, Catherine, if you want to just message me your votes through the chat, I'll tally them up and then I can kind of announce it at the end of each question. I think that might make the most sense.
All right. You sure we could relook at it and make sure that everybody votes again and try to do it really quickly? Because if we do it that way, then Catherine's vote is basically exposed each time.
Oh.
That's true.
Or she may get to vote twice.
So can you please clear the voting? Can you please clear the vote, Monica, and ask them to start over?
If you have 15, then Catherine's vote went through.
Let's just
No.
confirm. There was some concern about whether
I
that
think it
happened.
did.
I just started
Okay.
the voting over. So you all can now pick a new answer and then we'll tally them up.
When we get to 13 pretty quickly, as before. Okay, is there anybody right now who has not voted? Speak up. Okay, somebody just voted.
Okay, we have
that's it.
15
All
now.
right. Okay. Well, how's it go from 15 back to 14? Doesn't make sense.
You only click it once. You only click your answer choice once. It might lag a little bit, but
Okay, we're gonna go ahead. Everybody, please click your vote just once, because if you click it twice, it may unvote you. All right? Isn't that true, Monica? Is that
that is
the key
true.
here?
Yep.
Okay, so if you're waiting and you're watching and you're thinking maybe I need to click it again, don't. That will create more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so what is the answer? Actually, we can see the results first, and then what's the answer?
All right. So the correct answer is choice D, 1971. All right. And now I'll hand over the remaining questions to you, Steve.
All right, okay. Good luck. Keep your fingers crossed that we can get to 15. So we don't have that many questions, but we want to revisit the evidence and talk it through. So what I'm going to do is read the question and then turn to Dan or Lisa to discuss the kind of the really key findings again. This may be helpful if you can find your evidence summary tables in that handout that you received, the CTAF panel. Those are the key tables extracted from the report that Dan can refer to that kind of highlight the key information that you'll need as you think through these questions. So the first voting question is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of vedolizumab is superior to that provided by adalimumab? Yes or no? And please hold off on your votes until we have a chance to hear the discussion about it. Dan, can you just quickly summarize again the evidence rating given in the report and the rationale and the key table where this where the primary evidence is found?
Sure. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. So we rated the evidence B+ in favor of vedolizumab here on the strength largely of the varsity trial, the one head-to-head trial in our set, in which there was a benefit during the induction phase for both response, or actually for clinical response, for both naive and experienced patients. And then there were also benefits seen in clinical remission in the maintenance phase for biologic naive patients. On the strength of the NMA, which included the placebo-controlled trials for both of these agents, there were statistical differences in favor of vedolizumab throughout the biologic naive population and in the induction phase for the biologic experienced population.
All right, great. So a B+, which means, again, the ICER report team felt that they had high confidence that it was at least incrementally better or moderately to superior, moderate to substantially better.
So Stephen, the cost effectiveness model, I mean, the difference in qualities was very small.
Dan?
Yeah, so we've actually had a bit of texting back and forth about that. I think that's a function of both so there was a greater likelihood for most of these estimates in the NMA, somewhere between a 50 to 100% increase in the likelihood of response or remission with vedolizumab. But in part, the quality gains in the model are driven by how long the patients are on that first therapy. So the differences in qualities are small in part because patients switch relatively soon after starting. Lisa may have another comment on that as well.
No, I think that's the key. The key here is that, as Dan pointed out, the model, and there are important reasons we want to look at value in the long term, but if patients end up switching into the other options over time, it tends to kind of blend out. And so it's harder to find kind of significant quality differences over the long term if we're really only seeing a difference for a relatively short term for some or many patients. So it doesn't mean that in this case, again, we always provide you guys with obviously the full package of information. And some people may want to weight their view of the long-term clinical differences in one way. I think the reason that the team gave it a B+, as Dan said, was based on the fact that not only was the indirect network meta-analysis positive for vedolizumab, but the head-to-head trial also suggested short-term benefits over adalimumab. So other questions or comments about this? Actually, because I can't always see everybody, and I know everybody should know that we have our clinical experts and patient experts with us. When I invite either of the clinical experts, do you have anything that you'd like to add in the interpretation of the evidence as you see it for this voting question?
Yes, this is Bruce Sand. So I was the lead author on the varsity study. And, you know, it is a 1-year timeframe study. So we have to sort of extrapolate beyond that to really figure out what it does. But you heard about the heterogeneity of the patients. And there are, of course, many patients who do cycle off therapy, as is true with all of our therapies. But certainly for the patients for whom it works and continues to work, it's quite beneficial. And the only other comment that I would make is that to the extent that you did not really look extensively at the real world evidence about safety differences between vedolizumab and adalimumab or anti-TNFs in general, those differences are substantial in the minds of physicians and in patients as well, and not really reflected well in a 1-year study.
You want to say more about that, perhaps?
Yeah, because there are some really potentially serious but rare events that you wouldn't see in a study of a few hundred patients over 1 year, but in large populations you will see that. And I'm speaking as a provider who just saw a 22-year-old who had been on probably about 8 years of an anti-TNF diagnosed with a lymphoma just this week, one of the more dreaded complications of anti-TNFs. More common would be life-threatening infections with anti-TNFs. Again, these aren't very common, but they clearly do happen more frequently with anti-TNFs than with vedolizumab.
And was that something that the clinical team reviewed in some way?
Well, we did look at the observational data. We looked at large observational studies. There are studies summarized in our set that suggest what Dr. Sands is referring to, but there's not a consistent, there were not consistent findings with regard to differential infection or malignancy risk across the TNFs or in comparison of the TNFs to other classes. So at least in the set of studies we looked at, there were some studies that showed safety benefits for vedolizumab relative to anti-TNF therapy, but that wasn't consistent across all of the studies we observed.
Dr. Singh, do you have a view on this?
So I think there's just this paucity of real world evidence, so large population-based studies that Bruce was talking about for vedolizumab, they're maturing right now, but they're not there to conclusively and consistently demonstrate that they're safer. So which is why, for a drug that was approved 5 years ago, the cancer risk in population-based studies hasn't come up, which is why there's lack of evidence. Mechanistically, it sounds plausible. But I think that's where the discrepancy is, where as clinicians, we feel it's a safer medication. But when you look at the data, it's probably in development right now, but not published.
Okay. And just a comment for the CTAF panel, to the extent that you want to consider that consideration, it would push you more in favor, I guess, of saying that the evidence is adequate to say that vedolizumab is better than adalimumab. Although, as we've heard, it's to some extent the evidence is viewed differently, or it's still maturing on whether there's a significant safety difference between the two. Is that fair, Dr. Sands? I don't want to overdo it.
Well, I don't know if you included the latest safety data set for vedolizumab that was just published in September, which again really suggests significantly different rates of infection, much lower with vedolizumab than with anti-TNFs. So although there is relatively less data and less longitudinal data, and insofar as we can look at the signals, they really seem quite different with this agent as compared to the anti-TNFs, which clearly have an increased risk of infection, at least in our patients.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from the CTAF panel? All right. I know we're trying to do this efficiently because we want to talk about potential other benefits, et cetera. So why don't we go ahead and vote? Again, this is whether the evidence is adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of vedolizumab is superior to that provided by adalimumab. Monica, while we're doing this and continuing to have problems with the voting mechanisms, can we, or whether there's a chat or other function that not, so that we can maintain the confidentiality of the CTAF panel members? We seem to, well, we're getting close now. Not sure why we were bouncing. We'll wait another 10 seconds and then we'll just go with 14 votes. All right, why don't you go ahead and show the results? Okay, 12 yes and 2 no. All right, let's keep going. The next question is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of ustekinumab is superior to that provided by adalimumab? Yes or no? Dan, again, can you briefly summarize the findings in the report and the evidence rating?
Right, so no head-to-head evidence. In our network meta-analysis, the only place where we saw a statistical difference in favor of ustekinumab was in induction for the biologic experience population. So no differences in the biologic naive population and no differences in maintenance for biologic experienced.
All right. And so we gave it, the team gave it a C+.
C+, right. Ralph did bring up this the study that was not in our sample regarding cardiovascular risk. There are other studies that have actually shown no differences in cardiovascular risk. I just read a BMJ meta-analysis of 77 trials that suggested that neither IL-23s or IL-12/23s increase the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. So I think there's some competing results out there.
Any questions from the CTAF panel about the evidence base for this? Use your raised hand if you want to, or just speak up. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Why don't we go? Oh, sorry, Jeff. Okay, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I heard you right, Dan. It sounded like you said there was no difference. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, but regarding what? The safety question or the effectiveness question?
Sorry, the net health benefit.
Net health benefit. So in terms of, so we don't have any clear harms evidence to distinguish the two. On the clinical effectiveness side, from our network meta-analysis, we only have indirect comparisons to make here. We found no statistical differences in any of our subsets except for biologic experienced induction.
And the risk ratios are in the tables in the evidence summary, Dan. Is there a key one you would point them to on this one?
Well, I think that, so this would be table 7 and 8 for response and remission respectively. So ustekinumab, a risk ratio of 2.01 relative to adalimumab. So twice the likelihood of response in table 7 and 3.82 for remission in table 8. So those are the two statistically significant results out of a potential, I have to do the math quickly here, of 8.
And this is what encouraged you to give it a C+ rather than a C.
Right.
Got it.
So as we talked about a little bit before, the evidence has been kind of presented to you in these kind of biologic naive, biologic experienced induction and maintenance phases, which does, I mean, it's precise, if you will, more precise, but it makes it more complicated. Policymakers are likely to make kind of more global decisions and formulary placement and other kind of decisions. And so that's why we're wrapping it up in this voting question and asking you to kind of do the difficult task of looking at the results across these different subpopulations and different uses and deciding in your mind whether you think the evidence is adequate to say that it's superior to that of adalimumab. Any other questions? Okay, why don't we go ahead and complete the voting? All right, I feel sorry for there. Whoa, we got 15. Quick, show us the results. All right, 15 no and 0 yes. All right, we won't do too much of a debrief on that one. Let's move to the third voting question. Is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit among tofacitinib, ustekinumab, and vedolizumab? So here again, we're asking you to whether the evidence is adequate to distinguish among them. Dan?
So that's a very quick summary here. We found, so we only have indirect evidence to compare these three, and we found no statistical differences between them in any of our comparisons.
Any comments or questions? Clinical experts, feel free to jump in if you wish, or patient experts. You may be holding your fire for the potential other benefits and other questions. But... All right.
Yeah, I guess I would just say to keep in mind any distinctions in the TNF refractory patients, biologic experienced patients.
Can you help the panel interpret that a little bit further? What do you mean?
I'm simply making the point that the patients who have failed a TNF already, who are biologic experienced, are the most refractory patients and the most desperate, the hardest to treat, as we've already noted, and so are a special category of need.
Okay, I think, yeah, the need speaks to the formulary aspects. This one is whether there's evidence to say that any of these three are, for instance, much better than the other two. So we'll circle back on the need aspect.
Sure, I'm just pointing out with regard to what.
Right.
And the other two with regard to what.
Right. Well, it's to each other.
Yeah, I know.
And I just want to bring up one point. I think in all of this, we emphasize the p-value a little much. For example, for the ustekinumab versus adalimumab, the lower limit of the 95% confidence interval was 1, suggesting that, the likelihood of that agent being inferior is 0. So again, it's different ways of interpreting whether we focus on statistically significant results versus looking at the confidence intervals. And if you look at grade methodology and some of those things, the imprecision of a confidence interval that just crosses 1 leads to different decisions.
Right. Dan, any follow on to that?
So that is the case for some of the comparisons of ustekinumab and, ustekinumab and adalimumab. So for example, response and remission for induction in the biologic naive population. But in comparisons for maintenance, for example, we have confidence intervals or credible intervals that cross 1, that don't include 1. And that's for biologic naive. For biologic experienced, I mentioned the significant findings in favor of ustekinumab for induction, but for maintenance, in fact, again, confidence intervals that are very wide and include 1.
Right.
This is Annetta. I had a quick question for the experts. The vedolizumab safety data and when you're comparing that with Humira, are you pooling all TNF alpha antagonists across indications, or are you specifically looking at only TNF alpha antagonists across in use in ulcerative colitis patients? And yeah, so maybe I'll just ask that question and see what the answer is.
I think the data would suggest that either way, whether you pooled across all indications or all IBD indications, which would be Crohn's and UC, but even there are differences in those populations, or even if you just confined it to UC, those statements would be true.
Okay, and then you guys, the vedolizumab was sort of the follow-on to natalizumab. So would you pool the safety data from those two? No.
No, especially with regard to one important side effect, which is aggressive multifocal encephalopathy.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't we go ahead and complete the voting then? Is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit among these 3 treatments? We are close, and there we go. All right, 14 no and 1 yes. All right, so let's move to the potential other benefits and contextual consideration questions. So these are obviously framed very differently in several different ways, but now in a sense, we're moving to those floors of the pagoda that are benefits beyond health in some ways and kind of special priorities, ethical and social considerations. So these are important features, and the voting is going to be when compared to conventional therapy, does treating patients with any of the TIMs offer one or more of the following potential other benefits? So here we're not asking about any one of them. We're thinking about them as a class even though they have different mechanisms of action. Think of them as a group, I guess I should say, of new treatments. Do they offer one or more of the following potential other benefits that would be important for people who are assessing their broader value to consider? So let me just quickly read through them, and then we'll hear some, I think, some comments from the patient experts to start on this side. So A, these interventions offer reduced complexity versus conventional therapy that will significantly improve patient outcomes. B, these interventions will significantly reduce caregiver or broader family burden. C, these interventions offer a novel mechanism of action or approach that will allow successful treatment of many patients for whom other available treatments have failed. D, these interventions will have a significant impact on improving patients' ability to return to work and or their overall productivity. And E is a kind of, is there something else that we're missing here that we really should highlight as an important other potential benefit? So,
is there a none of the above?
Oh, you just would vote on, you would just vote on none. Yes, yes. So let me ask the patient experts, Laura and, oh, forgive me, I'm just blank. I want to say, I don't want to get your name wrong. Anyway, Laura and Megan, forgive me. Do you have any comments on these that you'd like to kind of share with the panel before they vote?
I would like to share, and I'm perhaps Megan will also. This is Laura. I think, you know, as you, the panel, consider all of the therapies, the fact that we've shown through the patient testimonies today that many patients don't respond to their initial treatment, and that having a novel mechanism of action and options available to the healthcare provider and the patient to make a decision on what's right for them is really important in the ulcerative colitis space, and that the ability of these different mechanisms of action to impact a patient's life, get them returning to work, returning to school. I think Roseanne's story of being able to complete her degree and become a productive member of society and then have children really demonstrates that finding that right treatment for the patient is essential. And we recognize that there's a lot more research to be done here to get to that precise right treatment, right time, right patient, but having the ability to leverage all available treatments is essential for the UC community right now. Thank you for letting me provide my comments.
Oh, sure, sure. And Megan, I'm sorry I forgot your name. I had Emily's name stuck in my mind, and I knew that wasn't your name, so I was trying
Emily
to find
is a good name too. So as I read down this list, I can probably give you an example from my life that supports every single one of these. It has allowed me to go from, like I said earlier, spending the majority of my day and my energy and my efforts just managing disease and all of the different arms that sort of play with that, to now getting an infusion every couple of months and being able to almost totally focus my energy on my life goals. So that includes careers, health, family, socialization, etc. In addition to advocating for the patient community. One thing that I also want to mention here is sort of there's some other health benefits that I think aren't always considered when you're not in it. And for me, that was being able to be active and exercise again. So I went from not being able to walk a half mile because one part just of the fatigue of chronic disease, and the other part of just, I would literally need to carry a bathroom under my body to account for my symptoms. But through the right treatment for me, I have run 2 marathons. I can eat vegetables. I can do all of the things that a typical patient would be encouraged to do for their health. So diet, exercise, sleeping better, all of those things, even keeping up on sort of those other things of health, going to the dentist even, because you're not so wrapped up in a bigger health issue. The night and day between being on the treatments that I originally started on, where I my life was laying on the couch eating white bread to where I am today is it's so far away, and it is only because of the treatment that I've found.
Thank you. That's actually really, really helpful. And it's also, I know you probably noticed that well, these drugs versus conventional treatment got an A, which is kind of our highest rating for certainty of evidence and the magnitude of the benefit. So you're kind of pushing it from an A towards the, we don't have an A+, but if we did, that's kind of what you were sharing. So that's helpful.
Yeah, and the more options there are, as all the other patients have said, different patients respond to different treatments and different combinations of treatments. So promoting the more choices in the marketplace make better for every patient, having those options. And it's, for us, options mean hope. It means there's more of a chance.
All right, hold that thought too, because we're coming back to the step therapy number of options question for sure. All right, any of the CTAF panel members, do you guys have any questions or comments that you'd like to make about these before we take a vote?
I just had one question.
Sure.
So A says that these interventions offer reduced complexity that will significantly improve patient outcomes. I'm just having a tough time interpreting that. Can you give an example of?
Yes. Sorry, I should have highlighted that one, because that one is there for one thing, these exist so that we don't forget something by accident in talking about value, but sometimes they really don't apply that much. That would be the case if we're looking at a new treatment that let's say is a pill, whereas all the other treatment options up till then had been an IV infusion. And you had to come every other week to the doctor's office versus being able to take it at home. So those kinds of things can lead to improved adherence and therefore better outcomes. So that's to capture that kind of situation. I don't think we're really in that, well, we're not really dealing with a strong example of that in this case.
So Steve, this is Annette. I guess I have a question first of all, I'd like to just say thank you to the patient experts and the patient advocates and our physician experts as well. It's extremely helpful to put this all into context. But I did have a question about, my concerns around equity and that, these are pretty expensive drugs, and it's pretty disappointing that even the biosimilars, are on the expensive side. And I do wonder, there was a slide earlier saying that we know very little about how this disease plays out in non-Caucasians. Are we talking about pushing them to colectomy and reserving this as a treatment option for white people with good insurance? And I'd like to hear from some of the patients and the patient advocates about that. Or the patient advocacy group.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought up that question, because you're pointing out a definite issue, and it's something the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, working with the Centers for Disease Control, we're actually doing a study right now on the health disparity and also around getting better prevalence and incidence numbers in the IBD community, but with a specific focus on understanding the incidence and prevalence in communities of color, and also analyzing, are these communities getting different care? And if so, what are the drivers of that different care, so that we can, through whether it's our research aim of the foundation or through our education, support, and advocacy, begin to address that health disparity and to bring a more equitable distribution of patient care to everyone with IBD, because it doesn't distinguish between race and ethnicity. IBD affects everyone. So we're working on that right now. We don't have the full conclusions, but it is our intention to understand these issues and then begin addressing them, whether it's through research, policy change, et cetera.
Thank you.
Great question, and thank you. And well, I was going to turn back to that question too towards the end on the work that you guys are doing on your research efforts. So we'll get a chance to comment again on that too. All right, we've got another set of contextual considerations to vote on after this. So let's go ahead and vote on these. Again, you vote on all that apply, A, B, C. Since we didn't really have an E that we wanted to highlight on this one, we vote for A, B, C, and or D. Any of and all of above. Now this one is a little bit trickier for us because you're taking multiple votes. Monica, I don't think we can tell when they've all completed voting, right?
No, if they voted, it doesn't matter how many answers they chose, it'll still only account for one vote, so.
Okay, good. So
Yep.
we will know when we get to 15 then.
Yep.
Oh, good. Our old technology didn't do that, so that's good. All right, so we're almost to 15. All right.
Steve, although if someone didn't agree with any of these, they don't have a way to vote, do they?
Oh, that's a good point. You would, I tell you what, if that's the case, then vote for E.
It's not a case in mind particularly, but I thought that was one
No,
potential
you're
issue.
right. You're right.
Yeah.
That you're a good logician because you saw the fly in the ointment on that one. No, you're right. If
Well,
someone does not-
Rita pointed it out, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
All right,
you.
well, we have 15, so let's see what we get. You can show the answers now. All right. So I'm going to assume that we did vote out of 15 because the numbers are not going to differ that much between that. But we have 2 for A, 9 obviously, B, 13, 12, and 2. And I'm pretty sure our denominator was 15. So you can see those results. Let's move to the contextual considerations. Apologies again, the font gets a little bit smaller, but we're still asking again about all the TIMs. And here we're saying, are any of the following contextual considerations important in assessing the long-term value for money of TIMs? So back to the pagoda, if you don't mind my analogy. And again, we're talking about things that you feel are important as part of that overall structure of value for people to think about. Select all that apply. 1, A, I should say, these interventions are intended for the care of individuals with a condition of particularly high severity in terms of the impact on the length of life and or the quality of life. B, these interventions are intended for the care of individuals with a condition that represents a particularly high lifetime burden of illness. C, these interventions are the first to offer any improvement for patients with this condition. D, compared to conventional therapy, there's significant uncertainty about the long-term risk of serious side effects of these interventions. E is compared to conventional therapy, there's significant uncertainty about the magnitude or the durability of the long-term benefits of these interventions. And F is some other contextual consideration that someone wants to highlight as being very important. So let's go back to questions. Sorry, I'm having a hard time actually seeing.
Steve, did B
Yes.
include early age of onset, or is that a separate consideration?
Well, early age of onset, since it's a chronic condition, you can certainly consider that as contributing to whether it has a high lifetime burden of illness compared to other conditions. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. So it's not like something that is severe can't also be a high lifetime burden of illness. But sometimes there are some conditions that are severe, fatal even, but don't really have a lifetime opposed to others. So this is meant to be kind of comprehensive in looking for those aspects. Any other questions about these?
Having a hard time distinguishing between A and B. It says high lifetime burden. It says high severity and impact on length of life. What's the difference between the two?
Well, I could give you an example of something that's high severity, but not high lifetime at least. That would be something like pancreatic cancer, where obviously it doesn't afflict you for a long time during your life. And some ethicists and other people feel that we would have different kinds of priorities that we would want to put to treatments for those kinds of conditions. Now, it's a little bit hard to imagine something that has a high lifetime burden of illness that isn't also particularly high severity. But some people might say that some mental health conditions over a lifetime might represent a high lifetime burden, but at any one point in time are not high severity compared to other conditions that might be rapidly fatal or something like that. So that's why it's a little bit harder to work the other way around, but that's the general distinction. Any comments or questions about these contextual issues?
I have a question about C. I'm just having a little bit of trouble because it's so definitive, or the first to offer any improvement for patients with this condition.
Joanna,
Can someone comment on that?
Thank you for asking about that. This is another one of those situations where we have a list that is meant to capture some situations that are not very common. But there's a long-standing feeling among commentaries, at least, that, for instance, let's imagine a rare genetic condition that has never had any treatment, and we have the first treatment ever for that condition. Some people believe that that represents a priority for us, and whether that means we would want or be willing to pay more for it or not, the idea is that there could be a social value attached to the first treatment for a condition that's never had an option before. The hard part is that every condition at some point has an unmet need where the existing treatments aren't working. So you could say that they all also need something new, but this was really meant to capture that relatively infrequent situation where we have never had a treatment available for something before. So obviously that would not really apply in this situation. There have been treatments for ulcerative colitis. All right, trying to catch up a little bit on our timeline. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to complete your voting because we have a value vote to come after this. I'm going to go ahead, even though it looks like we're missing one person's vote. I think we need to keep moving. So can we see the result? All right. Pretty high out of 15 on each of these. All right. And again, think of the pagoda. Maybe I need a different analogy because the word pagoda, anyway, these are important, and we do intend in our reports and in our meetings and in our final report for these to be highlighted for decision makers as part of the package of information they would look at. So let's use this now as we turn to the value vote on long-term value for a set of treatments. And I need to give a little bit.
Pagoda.
You like the pagoda?
I like the pictures.
Thanks. So long-winded question. Let me read it and then give a brief comment. The question reads, for biologic naive patients, given the available evidence now that you've seen on comparative clinical effectiveness and incremental cost effectiveness, and considering other benefits, disadvantages, and contextual considerations, sum it up. What is the long-term value for money of treatment at current pricing with infliximab, abda, and infliximab dyyb, the two biosimilars, versus conventional treatment? So a couple of comments. One is that we're obviously asking you about 3 different treatments. That was because their cost effectiveness tracked pretty closely one to the other. And you could always say that if they're clinically equivalent, that whichever one of these is lower priced is the higher value of the 3. We're not trying to ask you that question. We're really trying to ask you about this particular question because these treatments were the only ones that came close to the traditional cost effectiveness thresholds that I talked about at the very beginning of the meeting that mean that we're trying to meet that balance between treating and gaining the benefit of individual patient treatment with the broader population. So just to reflect again on the findings for this treatment, Lisa, if you can just chime in again and remind folks what the incremental cost effectiveness ratios at least were for these and which tables they can find them in the evidence summary. And if Lisa is not there, I can jump in because I'm trying to not lose pace here. If you're in your evidence summary tables, it's table 15 is the biologic naive population. That's where we have the evidence on infliximab. You can see there in that table the list price, the net price, and then the threshold pricing. I'm sorry, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio though, EECS would have to be on a previous table, which would be table 12, apologies. And that's the one that includes the indirect cost per quality gained. So as we talked about earlier, This is not the base case, in which the cost effectiveness ratios were around 186 to 212,000. But if you include the indirect costs, which is largely the productivity effects, you get findings between $75,000 per quality and $100,000 per quality. So we thought that this would be the important focus of a value vote, given that distinction between the base case in the healthcare perspective and the inclusion of indirect costs, dropping it down into the lower than 100,000 per quality range. Lisa, if you're available, or Josh, any other comments about the modeling that you'd like to bring up before we open the discussion?
Yes, I was on mute, so I apologize for that. But no, thank you for summarizing it.
Yeah, I agree. Good job. The only difference here, because there was equivalence in the outcomes, was on the net price for these. So that's what to keep in mind, as Steve mentioned. And just to summarize, the base case, they were the lowest ICERs, but still above 150,000, getting closer. But then when you consider the societal benefits, primarily driven by productivity issues, given the average age of this population, that does bring it down below. So that's sort of the totality in this biologic naive group.
So Paul, what's your take on this? You do health economics, you're a clinician, you're chair of the group as well, obviously. When you see a finding like this that has a distinction between the healthcare perspective and the indirect cost perspective, what does it make you think?
Well, I think it reflects the prior slide, that there is a long, that these people are young, there's a long-term burden, it's affecting their ability to work. So I think that the other just reaction I have is that, 3 categories is somewhat too limited. I mean, obviously we can't go on forever, but some drugs are just so incredibly higher priced, calling, that, and one that came in at maybe a little bit above your 150,000 threshold, but as both low, is misleading. So I think those are my 2 observations.
Great. Any other questions or comments from CTAF about this? Again, you're meant to integrate a lot. This is a hard voting question for multiple reasons, but this is where you're supposed to consider not just the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, but these other features. And so very open to any questions or comments. People who feel like they might be ready to vote high value, low value, or intermediate value want to make their claim and have their colleagues hear it out. That's something that we like to do too, if people have some strong thoughts on how they want to vote. Anthony, I saw you raise your hand.
Steve, yeah, I've got a question. So this question is specifically asking about infliximab, not the other potential treatments. Am I?
No, we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. We'd actually like you to think of all 3 together here, and not to distinguish them, and to consider that their cost effectiveness and their overall value. I know that they're priced differently right now, but not tremendously differently. So
we're infliximab and its 2 similars. That's what I'm trying to get. That's the only treatments we're talking about.
Oh, that's correct. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
The others, given our procedural methods, our procedure is not to take a vote on treatments whose cost effectiveness ratios are so far out of the boundary that it kind of, in a sense, it's not really helpful for the panel to weigh in, if you know what I mean. So, any questions or comments from any perspective on this question before we take a vote? Somebody who wants to vote, anybody who wants to vote low value, want to say why?
Even before we get to that, can I ask a point of clarification?
Absolutely.
Are we imagining we're giving advice with our vote to employers? Or are we imagining we're giving advice to people who might only be concerned with a healthcare perspective?
We have, as you know, Jeff is a modeler himself, and so there are long debates over the years around whether the kind of standing position should be one that looks at productivity at work or not. Because when we do that, we feel like we are being good, if you will, by recognizing the effect of treatment to help young college-age kids get back into school or work, and that's all good. And then we turn around and say, but if we do that to conditions that strike the elderly, or people with severe disabilities that don't do full-time work, are we somehow setting up a situation that enhances disparities in the healthcare system? And we might not want to do that. So different countries take different approaches on this. Most do not include the productivity as part of the key feature of value because it is the health system's money that they're trying to allocate and manage. But many other people feel like the right signal to send is to include those broader effects. And so we do offer to you the opportunity to have your own judgment on that. And that's one of the reasons why this vote was the one that we teed up for you, because I think it raises that very question.
If I could just follow up about the audience, who should we imagine might be reading this vote?
We know that both do, and so we will have both. The vote itself, obviously, we don't have statutory power in any way. The vote is almost a symbol of what do you think decision makers should think about. And I do know from our previous work, the decision makers here will include the employers themselves. It will include health plans themselves. It will include health plans in discussion with employers. It will include patients in discussion with policymakers. So there are lots of different audiences and even decisions that will be made. But the vote itself is more to send a signal, and we will capture differences of opinion on this point. But the important thing is that both numbers will exist for people to use in the discussions that others will have. So it's not clean because sometimes that's important, that it's not clean. So we're not going to try to send a signal that it is. Okay, great questions. Again, I want to make sure we have time to hear a lot of the debate around coverage and pricing as the policy roundtable. So why don't we go ahead and finish the voting here. You do have we're forcing you into a three-part vote here. It's either low value at the current pricing, it's intermediate value, it's high long-term value. And it's meant to integrate everything you've heard, uncertainty about it, all the other potential benefits, all of that kind of as part of your thinking. I'd love to get 15 votes out of this one, but we won't wait too much longer. Okay, let's go ahead and show the results. Oh, there we got 15 right at the end. Beautiful. All right. Well, it's not maybe a perfect bell curve, but I think it may express some of the issues that Jeff just raised about what some people thought it was a low value, some it was a high value, and most thought it was intermediate, probably because they were wrestling in some sense with some of these very issues. So that vote will actually help us in our description tease out, I think, some of the different perspectives that people should have when they look at the results of the cost effectiveness. And obviously, people will weigh these other potential benefits and contextual issues differently as well. All right, thank you guys very much. Now, we are how far behind? 10 minutes behind? We're gonna take a 5-minute break though. And we're gonna tee up it says 1:20, yikes. What we're gonna do is we're gonna come back at, what time is it? It is, okay, we're gonna come back at 4:35 Eastern, 1:35. So we're 15 minutes behind, and we are going to do a powerhouse policy roundtable in record time, okay? So we'll see you at 5 minutes past, 35 minutes past the hour.